Hello, my name is Benjamin Thompson. I'm an indie filmmaker, and this is my review of the KineMAX 6K. I'm going to try and be as comprehensive as I can. I'm sure I'm going to miss a few things. I wear a ton of hats, right? So sometimes I'm a DP, sometimes I'm a sound guy, sometimes, I'm any number of different things. And I like that. I love the whole film process. That's why I do it. But it often means that I'm a jack of all trades. So if there's some really technical stuff that I glaze over or should address more, just put a question in the comments. I don't think it's ever been harder to find a camera that fits you, because there are so many freaking options out there right now. The Canons, if your budget is under that 10,000 range, a lot of the older Canons have price drops. There's the FS7, there's of course the Blackmagics. There's just so many options right now, and they each have different characteristics, and in some ways that's good because it means that you can find one that's right for you. But in some ways it's stifling, right? Because you just spend, months literally looking at various cameras and agonizing over which one to get, and that was the way it was with me. So I got the KineMAX 6K predominantly because I liked the image. That's really the biggest reason that you should buy any camera. You gotta like the image. It's got a very grainy, fine, buttery feel to it. It reminds me of film, and I grew up in the 80s, and I'm nostalgic, and so I love that. So that's why I got it. It also had flexibility. It shoots in high frame rates, and it's high resolution. So I knew that it future-proofed me for at least a little while. But it also allows me to crop in when I need to. So it gave me the flexibility and the image I was looking for. Highest production value for the lowest cost. So let's talk about price. I believe I paid about $11,000 for the camera package together. I think I paid the price point that I did for this camera to get a lot of the extra options and a lot of the flexibility that the camera provides. There are a ton of frame rate combinations and resolution combinations in this camera, and there's just a lot of really customizable options in the menu system, which I'll get to later, that I think justify that higher price point. And so I'm very glad I bought it. I don't regret it. It was a good investment for me. I've already made my money back for the camera and then some. So as far as investment goes, I think it was a good choice. So the form factor of the camera is good in some ways and bad in others. The center of gravity of the camera is nice and low. You can watch the Zacuto review where they have the camera on a rig on the shoulder, and it's very nicely weighted, and it does feel good on your shoulder. The downside of the camera is when it comes to things like stabilizers. It's a long camera, right? So kind of picture it like an Alexa in a way. You need those extender arms if you're going to use a Ronin, or I haven't tried on a Movi, but I bet you there's going to be the same issues. So for a couple of reasons, it may be better for you, depending on your setup, to not get the integrated battery mount, to have the battery mount separate so that you can actually adjust that and then keep the length of the camera short. So that may be something to think about if you do get the camera. The record button's in a bit of an odd place, which is a good and a bad thing, right? You're not going to accidentally hit the record button, but sometimes it's kind of in the front of the camera. It's a little bit odd, and so I've worked with people that are just dumbfounded for a second when they're looking for the record button, and I gotta show them. But anyway, it's a good or a bad thing. I don't think it's terrible. There are no XLR inputs in this camera. I know they're gonna put them on the Terra, or it is already on the Terra, but it's fine because they give you an XLR box, which in itself could be handy, having XLR inputs that you can actually put in a different spot. As long as you have the cord that goes from the XLR box into the camera, you could feasibly put the XLR box somewhere else, which has its own flexibility, and that could be kind of nice. However, where they do have you put it currently is in this area. It's connected directly to the MoveCam handle, and it creates this situation where when you have an XLR cord going into the camera, into that box, the camera becomes very wide, especially if you have an EVF on one side of it. So if you got to take the camera off your tripod and you got to walk with it, there's like no comfortable way to walk with it, because on one side you have an XLR cord coming out and that hit your leg or whatever. And on the other side you have like an EVF. So if you didn't have that EVF over there and you just were using a monitor, then maybe you'd be fine. But I just found it a little bit awkward to carry that way when you're, if you do have to do a little run and gun with the camera. So the user interface is actually pretty intuitive. I came from DSLRs and using Blackmagics, and I find the menu system on this to be responsive and pretty easy to work with. And it's pretty big. There's a lot of different combinations, as I said before, that you can use. So at first it can seem intimidating. However, KineAffinity has been pretty conscious of that. And so they created a couple different tools that help you navigate the menus really quickly and help you get what you need on the run. So one of those things is the toggle button. So there's a little toggle button on the side of the camera that is wonderful. You can just spin it and select your menu options and navigate the menu really quickly, and you just press it in to select whatever you're going to select. And then there's a little button right behind that toggle that deselects. But it also does something that to me is one of the best parts about this camera. It is a quick, easily accessible preset menu. So when you press that little button, you can choose from any of 8 different presets that you need. So if you have a 35mm lens on and you need to crop in, you don't have to change your lens. If you can crop into Micro Four Thirds or Super 16 without changing your lens, and you can do it quick. You can press that little button and just change everything in your preset, and really it's just so convenient. I use it constantly, and so that's something I really enjoyed, and 8 presets is plenty for me. It gives me just enough to handle almost every situation that I come across. So that's been super nice. The little LCD is great as well. So a lot of times I'm not the camera operator, right? So I'm running around doing a million different things. And if the set is dark and maybe we're just using an EVF, I can just run up and quickly reference the frames per second, the ISO, and just a few other little parameters on the side there, and then move on. And it puts my mind at ease. So it's really nice to be able to see that screen. And originally they didn't have that until they updated the firmware, and I was pretty bummed out, but luckily they have updated the firmware, and that little LCD is really useful. So the codecs available with the camera currently are Cinema DNG, KineRAW, and Cineform. And I know that a firmware update is coming out, so they're going to trade the Cineform, I believe, for ProRes. And I think that's just due to marketing demand. I'm not necessarily pleased with it. I don't care that much, but I do like Cineform. And I'm a little bit wary. I'm not really sure whether I'll do the upgrade to the firmware, to the new firmware. But I think it will help because so many clients do request things in ProRes. So the one complaint that I do have about the codec options are that the high-speed options have to be recorded in KineRAW. I understand how perhaps they can't record in Cinema DNG at those because the data rates are perhaps just too heavy. The other thing that I've seen a lot of talk about on the Facebook forum, and I think I agree, is that you can't shoot straight up 4K in Super 35mm. That would be a really nice thing. Now, I've shot in micro four thirds 4K on this camera, and it comes out great. But you are losing some light capability. It isn't as good in low light when you do that. So being able to shoot on that Super 35 in 4K would really be an advantage for the camera. And I hope at some point in the future there will be a firmware update that allows us to do that. So the Cineform is a nice, straightforward codec for run and gun shooting, for when you don't have enough memory card to sustain you for the whole day, or enough SSD to sustain you for the whole day, or when you just don't need it, when it's just not necessary to shoot in RAW. Cinema DNG I do use in some low light conditions, because originally when I got the camera I did some tests, and I was getting better low light out of the Cinema DNG. I was getting better low light grain once I transcoded it, but now I've just had the camera for long enough that I'm now able to get the same low light condition quality out of the KineMAX codec, and I don't think I really ever use the Cinema DNG codec, so I don't know, maybe I never will. So it's a bit superfluous, but it is there should you need it. So frame rates. This is one of the best parts about the camera and one of the worst parts about the camera. Let's get the worst stuff out of the way. The worst part about the camera, to me, and I think according to most of the other KineMAX users, people who love the camera, say that the moire and the artifacts that come through on an aliasing that comes through during high speed mode is oftentimes just totally unacceptable. I have not found a environment perfect enough yet to shoot 225 frames per second and get a result that looked decent. The moire and the aliasing is so heavy, even after transcoding to ProRes, that it's just, you'd have to be in an environment that was just completely lacking of any kind of fine patterning to get away with it. And now a lot of the complaints I see with high-speed shooting is that the camera needs a ton of light. But if you look at most other cameras that are high frame rates, they need a lot of light too. And it's just the nature of the beast. You shoot at a high frame rate, you need a higher shutter speed. Now this camera is, there are some cameras out there that have better low light at high frame rates. But this camera, you have to drop the ISO down to about 320 to get acceptable noise levels in a lot of cases when you're doing that high frame rate. So you got a low ISO, you got high shutter speed. It's just, everything's working against you. So if you are going to shoot in high frame rates indoors, you better be ready to provide a ton of light because it's just necessary. So I have also found ways around that. One thing I would like to see in a future firmware update is a higher frame rate options that are not high speed mode. So it's nice in high speed mode because you don't get a lot of the rolling shutter that you might get in some circumstances in the non-high speed modes. But then you got to get the moire and the aliasing. So it's like a trade-off, but it would be really nice to be able to get some higher frame rates in non-high speed mode, even if there is rolling shutter. I'll take the rolling shutter in some cases if I can get a higher frame rate with something like Cineform. So maybe in the future with the new ProRes, I'll be able to do that. The resolutions with the camera. So it goes up to just under 6K, which is great. I shoot in 6K actually quite a bit. Originally when I got the camera, I didn't think I would. I thought I would be shooting in golden 3K like all the time. Now I'm shooting in golden 3K right now. This interview is done in golden 3K, which is great because you do get better low light images. It's actually really nice in low light. Originally, I had bought this camera thinking this is not a low light camera. And I wouldn't call it a super low light camera, but I also would not say it's bad in low light. There are a lot of conditions where I really am able to pull out a great image at pretty low light on this camera. So there are no internal NDs on this camera. Now that is an inconvenience. It's definitely a downside to the camera. It hasn't affected my workflow very much because I'm not in a very fast-paced environment, but I could definitely see how it's a downside for journalistic and run and gun type work. But the 6K does allow me to crop when I need to, and man, it just creates really great images. When you pull that 6K back down to 4K or 3K or just 1080p, you get some really sweet images in that. And man, the detail is like otherworldly. You will often find that you have to soften the image a little bit and add some more grain because it is so damn sharp. So the camera does have a rolling shutter. It's definitely apparent if you're moving the camera very quickly. My workaround to this has been to use Micro Four Thirds 4K high speed mode, which dramatically reduces any rolling shutter to a point where it's not noticeable. So I did this review using the internal preamps on the camera. There's no external recorder. This is an NTG3 going straight from an XLR right into the XLR box. And I think it's pretty good, actually. I'm quite pleased with the sound that's coming through on the camera. It's a low noise floor. When I can, I still use an external recorder, and then I'll record through a scratch track onto the camera. But for run and gun shooting, I've been just super pleased with it. To get the camera up and running, I bought an Alphatron EVF with the bracket. I bought a digital 150 battery, and I also had the KineMAX, the EF KineMAX sent with the camera. So the KineMAX gives you an extra stop of light, and it allows you to shoot just short of full frame, which is great. I've really enjoyed that, and it's allowed me to use some lenses that aren't quite as wide as I would like in scenarios, and it gives me a little bit extra room. So I've put a Sigma lens on it for this interview, which I'm not particularly fond of, but one of the things I ran into with the camera was that I bought a Canon 2.8 16-35 that I threw on the camera when I first got it, and the camera could not communicate with the iris. Now, I think that's actually the KineMAX that's causing that problem, and I contacted Kinefinity, and they got right back to me, but I did have to sell the lens at a loss because there was no communication. I couldn't change the iris, and the Sigmas have worked very well for me. But I would strongly suggest that if you do buy the camera, you're using that KineMAX, to go to a rental house or a camera shop, take your camera in, and just put a lens on, one lens after another, and just make sure that they work before you go off and you order ones and have to go through what I went through. So my experience with Kinefinity so far has been pretty darn positive. I spoke with their US distribution guy. He was super helpful. He's used the camera quite a bit himself, and he knows it. And he addressed the concerns that I had when I first bought the camera very well. He got back to me quickly. And when I was dealing with Kinefinity, when I ordered the camera, they got back to me really quickly too. And the community for the camera has been great. At this point, it's still, I guess, kind of small it's small compared to a lot of other camera manufacturers, but the Facebook online forum is just full of a bunch of really great people who are putting up better and better projects day after day. They're always communicating with each other. They're helping each other out, and I've had just nothing but positive feedback on that, and they've been very, very helpful. So when I have a problem, I post it on Facebook, and then we all talk about it, and we figure out what it is, and we move forward. So Scratch. I also want to take a minute to talk about Scratch. I love Scratch. Scratch Assimilate, it feels like it's brought me to a new level. I've been working in Adobe and some Final Cut and for years. I love After Effects, Premiere Pro, and I use them. I know them like the back of my hand. But when I started working in Scratch, at first I was intimidated because it is totally different from what you're really used to. The terminology is different. The interface certainly has a learning curve to it. But once you get going with it, you find a level of not just customization, but you can just change stuff and reference stuff so much quicker. Everything feels faster. Give you an example. I have a GTX 670 graphics card on my computer, and I don't have 4K monitors. But I can almost just about watch 6K footage in real time on Scratch. You get the camera that you really just feel right about. This camera felt right to me, right? I love it. I wouldn't go back on it. There are disadvantages to it, but I think they're far outweighed by the just wonderful amount of options that you can that you can use with this camera. So it's just continually surprised me. I keep getting better and better images out of it, and you know, I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. I think there's an image out of this camera that is comparable with anything at any price point on the market right now. It's a bold statement, but I think it's true. So my recommendations for you, if you're strictly a run and gun shooter, it's pretty close. There are other cameras out there that are probably lighter and probably a little bit more advantageous to that straight run and gun fast workflow afterwards, that have codecs that are a bit lighter. And so, you know, maybe that isn't your best choice if that's all you're doing. But if you want a good crossover camera where sometimes you do run and gun, but you also do production work, this is a great camera. I definitely recommend it for that. If you're just doing production work, I think it's an awesome camera. You know, it's just provides everything that you need. If you're making, you know, narrative film, or you're just working in an environment with a crew where you need to be able to really customize it down to the exact specifications that you need. It's fabulous. So go out, tell great stories, make great movies. No matter what you get, good luck to you, and thank you for listening.